Senator Edward M. Kennedy, Disability Rights Leadership Series, 1999-2000, a project of Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, DREDF, with Access Video, University of San Francisco.
Okay, so from your perspective only, what do you see as some of the turning points in the passage of the bill?
Well, if you look at this sort of globally, if you look at in the 1980s, we were making some progress in the areas of civil rights, and then we had the introduction of very broad sweeping legislation by Senator Weicker, and it seemed at the time of the introduction, even though it was focused on an area that cried out for need and for action, that it was so broad in scope, although it was obviously a continuation of Senator Weicker's long-standing interest in trying to make progress on meeting the challenges of those of disability. But I think in the there were several very important and significant moments, I think, along the pathway. I think one was the time of the actual markup and the reporting out of the legislation. I've been in the Senate for a long period of time, and generally speaking, if you call a meeting of a committee after the Senate is out in the daytime, it's rare that you ever get 2 or 3 members to come, let alone enough to really mark up a bill. And as we were going through the evening time and marking up the bill, more often than not, the members leave because they have engagements in the evening, or then at times it gets to late in the evening and they want to go home. And what happened at about 11 or 11:30 at night, there were members of the committee that were opposed to the legislation and taking out books and started reading. I mean, a real old-time filibuster. And that is usually a time when people say, well, okay, we'll try and bring this out the next day. But no, people stayed. And what happened are people, the committee, more and more people came to the committee. And so as the night went on after midnight, almost all the members of the committee came. And also what happened is that the press took an interest in it. And so they began to show up to pay attention. But what was absolutely extraordinary to me, and what made an indelible impression upon all the members, is the community. The disability community came to that hearing in wheelchairs, packed that room at 1:30 or 2 in the morning, and we got the legislation out. And what it said to every member of that committee, and Republican, Democrats alike, is we're serious about this, and we're not going to take no for an answer. And it isn't if we're going to pass it, but when we're going to pass it. And that created an atmosphere and a climate in terms of not only the committee, but I think in the Senate, that said this is serious business. We're going to address it later on in the session. I think that was a powerful one.
Why was everybody coming? Because of the pressure?
Well, the power of the issue. I think this was really the institution acting at its best. I mean,
yeah,
sometimes
but I've got dinner parties to go to.
I know. Well, and that's what happens on so many issues and many that I've been involved in and care deeply about. And but that wasn't true about this issue at this time. And I think it is something that was enormously powerful in terms of the compelling nature of trying to strike down the discriminations in the form of disability. I think that was one. Secondly, there was a very important sort of change in terms of the scope of the legislation. We were really at odds with administrations and with important groups in the House and the Senate, special interests. But when we were able to try and ourselves sort of bring greater focus in the areas of transportation, in the areas of public accommodations, in terms of employment, and in the areas of communication, to bring a tighter scope to this, then suddenly I saw the sort of a change in terms of the willingness to engage and talk about these issues. And that was something that took place in the late spring. Otherwise, we were running up against the arguments, what are you going to do when ski lift in Mount Sunapee when a wheelchair person comes up. Are we going to require every chair and the chairlift to be accessible to someone in a wheelchair? And I can remember others that said, what are we going to do in a bookstore, small bookstore in Keene, New Hampshire, if we have one person in there and a blind person comes in, will that person have to leave the counter and go back and help the blind person, or will they be able to stay there? There was an awful lot of fly specking from those that were opposed to the legislation, but we were able to overcome that at a very important meeting that we had in the Capitol later on.
I mean, that famous Sununu meeting. We've heard from most of the people. Thornburg talked to us about it. Senator Harkin talked to us about it. Bobby, Carolyn, all talked to us about it. And yes, give me that meeting from your perspective.
Oh, well, I'll let others who were. We were at a rather important time. I think, quite frankly, the momentum then had become so powerful. I think by that time there was an inevitability about the legislation, but there were still important issues to be resolved, but they were resolvable. We weren't. The progress was moving, I think, irrevocably towards passage, but we still had problems. And this was hopefully going to be the last negotiation on these matters, and it involved the smaller impact of certain provisions on smaller business. And there was the emotions were very hot and heavy, and there was good exchange and powerful exchange, and tempers were frayed, and people were tired, and those of us who were strongly committed were constantly reminding ourselves, well, we have to listen to these arguments, even though we were so strongly convinced that the arguments were not as strong as might be imagined on it. And so there was some pretty strong exchanges during the course of the meeting. I'd rather leave that descriptions up to others, but what isn't tolerable when you're in those kinds of expressions and exchanges, I always saw it as that we were working as sort of a group and a team, and there wasn't sort of a pecking order in terms of who were senators and who were staff and who were others. We were all in this together, and who were representing Pat Wright, others that were there leading in terms of the community. We were all just a part of a team, and so there were times when tempers flared, and there was some effort to diminish the standing of certain people there, which some of us took exception to. But the meeting...
Senator Harkin says, well, I'm sitting there, Bobby works for me. Okay, I probably should be saying something, but it's a new-new. I don't know what to do. And there's Ted.
Well, Tom Harkin has just been not only on this legislation, but really our leader on so many of the issues on progress and disability in the Senate. I take my hat off to him every day.
But it wasn't just the argument. I mean, it's that, being in charge helped, but something more important came out of that meeting.
Well, that's true. I think the concept, the approach changed from being a special legislation for a special group to being an extension of the protections of civil rights for Americans. And this change in viewing this had an effect in people's thinking. If you think that this is a continuation of the guarantee of equal rights, and what we are basically doing is making progress in eliminating forms of discrimination against people with disability, you come to, I think, different conclusions than if you're looking at special legislation to try and look at some particular group. And what we were also looking for is a sort of equal opportunity, so a broader kind of context in terms of people that we're going to look at. So I think that was very, very important. And so we were able to, I think, get through the last of what I thought were the points of difference until we reached the floor. And then, although this is such a major piece of legislation, still we were able to get through in a very short period of time. One day, I remember late in the day when an amendment was offered by Senator Helms from North Carolina, and Tom Harkin, who was floor manager, and I went out and could see he took some exceptions to the definition on disability, and he was going to exclude large groups of people, and this looked like we were in crisis again, and we were able to work through that. Actually, Bill Roper from the administration was helpful in working that through at a period of time, and we were able to get the legislation
I mean,
passed.
people have described that as sort of funny almost.
Yeah, well, it was. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so important and serious, and that was, of course, enormously important. And then we had the other negotiations with the House, the whole debate on the Chapman amendments, which could have, if we had yielded on this to ideology rather than science in terms of what were going to be the conditions of employment, then we would have enshrined, even though you could say, well, let's just take that now and put it in the bill and get the rest of it passed, but you would have enshrined in the legislation ideology, and we were trying to free, this legislation was important for the message that it sent, and that is that we were going to free ourselves from ideology on this issue, which was the AIDS issue, and look at sound science instead of being wrapped up into a partisan political issue. And
but you make it sound so simple. I mean, that
well,
was.
it wasn't.
If
That
we're talking
was
about 1990, I mean, we're talking about the United States Congress.
But we have made enormous progress. But we should be mindful.
But take me back to that.
We still come back to the fact we're still not there yet, and in terms of freeing ourselves from forms of intolerance in our society.
I was shocked that Pat and whoever could hold the disability community together on that issue.
That's right.
Much less, how in the world did you hold Congress together with that issue? I mean, it's a real question.
Well, I think that because I like to listen to the people who are going to be impacted legislatively. I think it's a pretty good question. On any piece of legislation, you ask yourself who's going to benefit and who's going to who is going to be opposed to it. And when you come out and then try and guide yourself by these results, it was very clear that in this particular issue on the Chapman, even though it was a smaller, you could say, well, this is just one section and it only applied to certain kind of workers. It undermined in a very important and significant way the basic freedom that this legislation, this Declaration of Independence, of freedom for those with disability, and Pat Wright and the organizations would not compromise on that principle. And I think it was a wise judgment, although there were people that were attempting to second guess it at the time. But it was a wise judgment, the right decision, and fortunately.
But see, you're not answering the question. How the hell did you get it through, given the attitudes of the time?
Well, it's these are just constant perseverance. Lord, make honor bright. I mean, it's keeping after things and pursuing them, and we had a lot of help. I think, but if we didn't have the action of the disability community and being so involved, understanding the principle that was involved and so intense about it, we wouldn't have. But that was really a victory for the community. They were the ones that really changed the attitudes. We had made the arguments, but they were the ones that really turned the tide.
There was a different role for the activists than unusual legislation,
That's right.
right?
Absolutely.
I mean, it seems to me I'm just the interviewer, but it seemed to me that people sort of really personalized it, that was a strategy that worked, that's different than other lobbyists, is that?
Well, the intensity of the feeling, and I think the legitimacy of the demands, and this institution does respond sometimes Not always, but sometimes. But it did in this situation, and importantly so.
And what do you think was your personal contribution to this?
Well, I don't. I think trying to be reflective of those that had disability and their hopes and their dreams. I mean, this was obviously it was something relatively easy for me to identify with because of my own son Teddy's experience, and lost a leg to cancer, and I've had scores of small instances as well as larger instances where that particular issue was something that I was able to understand much better about how he viewed it, and being very close to him, it is something that I was able to
Can you remember
understand. Well, we'd go to he'd travel with me, and we'd go to a community, and Sunday morning would be there, and we'd go to church, and if the church wasn't accessible, then he'd say, "Excuse me, Dad," and he'd sit outside and read his prayer book and say his prayers outside till the Mass was over, and then he wouldn't say anything really more about it. He'd ask me whether he thought it was good if he went and said a word to the pastor or not. There might have been occasions where it was suitable, and other occasions probably not. It was, a constant kind of reminder about the importance of accessibility on this. And I think having that kind of experience, and he then ran a foundation facing the challenge to try and open up employment possibilities for people with disabilities in Massachusetts that I was very familiar with during the 80s, and so I had the benefit of having some important insights, and then having the benefit of a wonderful sister who's mentally retarded. I had also some insights into this. So I think being able to perhaps become even more emotionally involved in it was perhaps of some value. And I think certainly the highlight of it, this whole experience, was sitting with my son Teddy and Pat Wright, and we were, I think, about 55 or 65 rows back at the time of the signing of this in the White House. But we were back there with a lot of the people that had made the difference, and that was the place to be.
So it didn't, I mean, I know it was a snub, but it didn't matter to you, or everyone talked about, I mean, President Bush said that was, many people, that was a very proud moment for them.
Well, I think it was a proud moment for the country, and I always think the community made this nation a fairer and a better country because of it, and they ought to get the sense of satisfaction from making this country the America that all of us want to be, and we came closer to it that day, and when the legislation was signed.
I mean, it's, without the civil rights, you want to need a glass of water here?
Yeah, I think we're pretty well. I think we.
Okay, I got one more question.
Yeah, I think I've sort of done it up here. There we go. All right. There we go.
All right, last question. 10 years out, what have we accomplished? What do we have to accomplish?
This legislation was obviously a benchmark achievement for those with disabilities. If you look at what the conditions were a generation before and compare it to now, it's monumental. And the progress that was made in the 80s, and then I think achieved with that legislation, was monumental. But we still have important ways to go, and particularly in the areas of health care. And we made some progress in this last Congress with regards to employment and health care, but we still have to try and continue to recognize the special health care circumstances that many of those with a disability are facing. And I think we still have to continue to make progress in terms of these other areas. Employment, this was important, but we still have a long ways to go. There's still a lot of inequities. I mean, we just take a small area where children who have special needs, and the only way they get the coverage if they stay on Medicaid, and yet the parents can make more money than being on the Medicaid, but they lose the coverage for their health insurance, and this is not only then holding that family back, but it's impacting the other members of the family and their inability to move ahead. I mean, there are absolutely some nonsensical things that are out there, both in legislation and in force in law, and we've got to change those. And so the battle continues. But
Indulge one last question. The average American does not, in my opinion, still understand that this is a civil rights law.
Mm.
Why is that? What is the one thing you want the general public to get?
Well, I think this. I mean, for many of us who were very much involved in the whole issues of civil rights, you take 1988. We passed the Fair Housing Act, and it virtually passed unanimous. Fair housing to stop discrimination on the basis of race. But in that 88 Act, we included discrimination against those that had disability. They were tied together on this. This was really the year, 2 years, 2.5 years prior to the ADA. And so once we were able to get the thinking back into the fact that this was civil rights rather than just special legislation, I think we created a climate and an atmosphere of understanding with our colleagues in the Senate that was really the basis of the progress we were able to make on that legislation. But, we still have much to do.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Okay.
Disability Rights Leadership Series, 1999-2000. Producer, Phyllis Ward, Access Video. Interviewers, Phyllis Ward and Mary Lou Breslin. Post-production, editing, captions, audio description, Dave Newell. Stewardship, promotion, distribution. Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. Mary Lou Breslin, Susan Henderson. Special thanks goes to both the sung and the unsung heroes who worked tirelessly to make the Americans with Disabilities Act a reality. The Disability Rights Leadership Series owes a debt of gratitude to the individuals who agreed to be interviewed and without whose passion and dedication the ADA would not have become law. The series would not have come about without the vision of Pat Wright, longtime Director of Governmental Affairs for DREDF, and Arlene Mayerson, DREDF's directing attorney, who conceptualized the series and the interview themes. Thanks goes to the University of San Francisco for sponsoring the project that included the Disability Rights Leadership Series, and the Bancroft Library, University of California, Berkeley, for accepting an archival copy of the unedited interviews and providing a safe and permanent home for the collection. The series would not have been possible without funding from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. A list of the interviewees and links to their interviews can be found at dredf.org. 2015.